once I'd received, I was like, great, finally I'm into this. I can fit in. I've got the tick of approval. I'm considered saved. And then when I sort of went to use this tongue amongst the adults, and it just didn't feel right. And that's when my doubts first started, when I was 10.
That's Tom Tilley, one of Australia's most recognised journalists. Tom's just written a book about his life growing up in a Pentecostal sect that believed it was the only true church.
I always saw my whole life in the church. I never thought, oh, one day I'm out of here. I thought, no, I'm going to try and make this work. I want to be with my family. I want to meet the Lord in the air.
The church was based around speaking in tongues, with members believing they could receive the Holy Spirit and speak directly to God in their own divine language.
A language that no one knows. What to someone else will sound like a foreign language or a little bit like gobbledygook. Our church believed that you had to have that experience to truly be saved, which set it apart from any other church that we knew.
Tom was split between two worlds, with his life inside the church butting up against everything on the outer till there wasn't room for both.
I realised I wanted to live a big, beautiful life. I wanted to be open-hearted and to connect with people and feel that passion of life. And I could see that the strictness of the church wasn't letting me do that.
Tom's had to question everything in his pursuit of the truth and rebuild himself as a man without God. It's a fascinating story, and one that should be heard by anyone struggling to choose the life they want to live.
While that might feel really daunting at the start, there is a way through that.
Welcome to Young Blood, an award-winning podcast on a mission to make the mental health of young men a top priority. My name's Callum McPherson, I'm a journalist, and this is our platform to open up and share stories of what we've been through, because we're not alone. Let's do it. Before we kick this off, I just want to say thanks so much to everyone who's taken 15 to 90 seconds out of their day to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. It boosts us up the ranks massively and makes a huge difference to how many people we can reach with these potentially life-saving stories. So thank you. And for those who haven't got around to it, please, if Young Blood has delivered you some value, let us know on there. Cheers, legends. Tom, one of your earliest memories is of you in church as a 3 or 4 year old boy. Do you remember how you felt inside being in that environment at that time?
Yeah, I felt very comfortable. I felt very safe, and I felt really loved. I set the scene for the book lying there on the carpet as a little kid during a Wednesday night meeting. And at this hall in Dubbo, it was like our second home. We lived just a few blocks up the road, and probably at least 2, sometimes 3 or 4 times a week we were at this hall with what was like our extended family, all the other members of the church. We had all these ready-made best friends, the other kids of the other parents in the church. All their parents were there. We knew them so well. They'd known us since birth. We were very much all on the same railway tracks of life, living the same schedule, same beliefs, same fun activities, same serious moments. It wasn't that far from the womb. It was a warm, friendly, safe, beautiful place.
Sounds lovely. What did your church believe?
So the thing that made our church unique to most other Christian churches was that it believed that speaking in tongues was clear proof that you were saved, that the Spirit of God was in you. So speaking in tongues is in the Bible, happens on the day of Pentecost, and it's this moment where God's Holy Spirit is supposedly manifested in these men on earth who prayed and spoke in a language they'd never learned before. And so at that time, they spoke out in languages of neighboring cultures and ethnic groups. So there were people from different parts of the Mediterranean and the Middle East who witnessed this, saying, wow, these people are speaking our languages and they've clearly never learned it before. This is absolutely mind-blowing. So that was proof that God was real. Then a slightly different form of speaking in tongues is when you speak out in just a language that no one knows. What to someone else will sound like a foreign language or a little bit like gobbledygook is that person's personal language. And we believe that that was your own way of directly connecting to God. So instead of going through the normal linguistic programming of formulating sentences, dear Lord, please help me pass this university exam. This was supposedly just like a direct connection where you just spoke out and these words just flowed out of your mouth and you connected directly to God. So our church believed that you had to have that experience to truly be saved, which set it apart from any other church that we knew.
And put a lot of pressure on you from a young age to be able to speak in tongues. And I know you talk about how everyone around you, your family, were already speaking in tongues before you could, and felt quite a bit of pressure throughout those young years to, come on, I want the Holy Spirit to speak through me, because otherwise you weren't going to be saved. So that's a lot of pressure to put on a young kid, isn't it?
Yeah, it really was. And I don't think I quite, spotted it straight away as a kid, because it was just always a part of our lives. It was something we knew everyone else did. We expected it would happen to us one day and tried to push out any doubts about it not happening.
And was it also the fact that if you had doubts, then it wouldn't happen?
Well, yeah, exactly. So you start to double guess yourself, and then you start to blame yourself, which is where it can get a little bit dark, really, a little bit sad for a kid who's like, oh, maybe it's my fault if it's not happening.
Yeah.
And, you're surrounded by these other kids, and as I write, my younger brother Sam received the Holy Spirit before I did. So he was 7 and I was 9, and I still hadn't received. So that's how early in our lives this was happening, that we were seeking for this so-called gift from God.
And it seems like it would often happen in front of the rest of the church. Like there was almost events or moments set up where you were sort of supposed to speak in tongues, and that's when it was meant to happen. But that's not how it happened for you the first time. And in fact, when you had a few of those moments, you sort of failed to speak in tongues, and then had to carry some shame around that, because like you said, you then question yourself and, does God love me? And having to carry that must have been a hell of a thing as a 9-year-old kid.
Yeah, it's, when you write the story from an adult perspective, you sort of sense the heaviness, and it did get heavier later on. But in the early stages, it was okay. It was what we were doing, and it was more of like an excitement about when it would happen. So, without that adult perspective, it was still very naive and still had a sense of joy and excitement about it. But the pressure was ramping up. But for me, I felt that it happened at this moment in a cabin on the south coast of New South Wales when I was 10. So 10 was a good age, because it was like, it wasn't like ridiculous. Like when my brother received, he was 7, and another friend of ours, Jarrah, was 5. We're like, that's lacking a little credibility. So at 10, I was kind of like, yeah, 10 feels good. But if I'd gotten to like 13, 14, then it would have gotten really awkward.
And then you would congregate in church and everyone would speak in tongues at once in their own version of what that was. And you'd be listening out and hearing some of the other kids speaking in tongues, thinking, those tongues sound like bullshit. I don't know if that's real or not. And then realizing that, how legit does my speaking in tongues sound compared to the adults who've obviously been doing it for a longer time. And that whole performative element of it must have been very intense to sit or stand in church with all these people speaking in this language, and that was just a normalized thing.
Yeah, and that's why the questions came up so quickly for me, because all of us kids sounded ridiculous. So we sounded absolutely non-credible, whereas the adults had these languages that really sounded like full languages, like lots of syllables.
Yeah.
Like they literally sounded like Hebrew or French or, these foreign languages.
Uh-huh.
Some of them were really beautiful. Some of them were really intense, sounded really aggressive. They had this sort of full span of sounds and syllables and, consonants and vowels, whereas all of us kids were just, it was like, really? So that's why once I'd received, I was like, great, finally I'm into this. I can fit in. I've got the tick of approval. I'm considered saved. And then when I sort of went to use this tongue amongst the adults, and it just didn't feel right. And that's when my doubts first started, when I was 10.
Mm. And how was God portrayed to you?
Typical sort of godlike figure. We started with all the Old Testament stories where you get a sense of God's, I think, the tougher side of his character. I write about one of the stories that really gripped me early on was Isaac and his dad, Abraham, and God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, basically,
As a
kill him
test.
up on a mountaintop. Yeah. And so I was like, oh, God's
Pretty full on.
pretty...
He's a pretty full-on character.
Yeah. We had other stories like Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, and all those big tales. They're pretty intense.
And you had to act some of those out in plays and stuff for the rest of the church, didn't you?
Yeah. So that was fun, and that was another really good part of the church, was all the sort of performance, which really built your confidence, and I enjoyed that. But that's how we learned a lot of those stories. And yeah, if you've read much of the Old Testament, a lot of it's kind of intense and gruesome. There's not like it didn't seem like we were handpicking the stories full of like joy and mercy.
Yep. What was the description of hell?
A lake of fire and brimstone, eternal anguish. Yeah, that was the vibe.
Yeah. So it seems pretty obvious that you had a very strong sense of community connection, and you did all these really fun activities and did the camping trips and the big dinners and did everything together. And a lot about that sounds really good and something that in human nature would be a very positive thing, but then with this undertone of looming potential eternal damnation. What did that mean that the atmosphere was like, especially as you got a bit older? Was it tense?
It always felt more positive than negative up to the point where it didn't. But for me, that probably didn't come till about the age of 19 and 20. So it was always tough. There were always compromises. Like one of the hardest rules that we faced was being not allowed to have a girlfriend outside of the church, and not allowed to have a girlfriend until the age of 17. And yeah, for anyone watching, listening to this, who's same-sex attracted or anything other than heteronormative, there was absolutely no space for that whatsoever in the views of our church. So very hard line on those kinds of issues. Definitely wouldn't have been voting yes in the same-sex marriage plebiscite, put it that way.
And there was a line from the book where you say the not drinking thing I could handle, not having a girlfriend was much harder.
Well, alcohol didn't look that appealing to me as a teenager. My mates, righto, yep, we're all meeting at Carl Park behind the footy stadium before the school social to get pissed before we go to the school social. Then they turn up to the school social looking horrific. This sort of like dopey, dumb look in their eyes, like they could either fall asleep or punch you in the face. And then I just sort of looked around the community, and and then the first few alcohol like parties where there were alcohol in high school, I thought it was disgusting. So I didn't struggle too much with not drinking, but look, Mudgee High School was a hotbed of beautiful, smart, intelligent girls. And so not having a girlfriend at like 13, 14, 15, I was like, this sucks.
Yeah, and how did that sexual repression affect you during those years? Because especially during those teenage years when the testosterone's really peaking and there's not much on teenage boys' minds other than girls a lot of the time, or discovering their sexuality. And you were conditioned to associate sex with guilt. So how did you juggle that? And I suppose a second part of that question, did it take quite a bit to get over that association as you got into your adult life in terms of relationships with women?
So, because the rules were quite clear and strict, and because, I wasn't a rebellious kid. Like I said before, I found it hard, but I didn't find it impossible. And I bought into the dream as well. I wasn't always of a super critical mind, even though I had my doubts. And I thought the idea of saving yourself for marriage was beautiful. I totally bought into that. And I thought, how wonderful would it be to meet the love of my life and my future wife, and us, neither of us having had been with anyone else. I thought that was a really nice thing that I actually genuinely aspired to. So, okay, I wasn't allowed to have a girlfriend from high school. So then I never sort of got that close or that tempted at high school. And then I sort of had a few fleeting, mostly pen pal based romances with girls in the church.
With Bridget?
And so then, what's that?
With Bridget?
Yeah. That's not her real name, by the way. That was one of the names I had to change.
Okay, not Bridget.
Yeah.
You know who you are.
Bridget, not Bridget. Yeah. Maybe she's going to come across this. Yeah, so these like cute little pen pal relationships that were just ridiculous. Very, very Jane Austen kind of era, not of the modern day.
But then you did end up having your first proper girlfriend, who was Kate, and that was when you were in your much later teenage years into your early 20s going to uni.
Yeah, so that was my first like going official kind of girlfriend.
Yeah, and you had to actually ask your
I...
dad for permission to have a girlfriend, didn't you?
Yeah, and she had to ask her dad because her dad was a pastor as well.
Yeah.
So I was heading into my HSC exams and she was 1 year out of school already. And had our first kiss on Manly Beach on the October long weekend.
I'm guessing you weren't.
I'm
guessing you weren't the best kisser to start off with. But she probably wasn't either.
You'd have to ask her that, and that's not her real name either.
Yeah. But just to take you back throughout your whole schooling life, how did the church affect that with kids who were outside of the church in terms of how they viewed you and how you viewed them, and just the impact that it had on your life overall growing up?
Yeah, well, I was really social and loved getting to know everyone at school and super active in sport and all elements of Mudgee life. And then the church life was almost something that I lived in parallel. And while I didn't hide it, it was never something that I talked about. I was a bit embarrassed by it secretly, and especially the details of it, like the speaking in tongues side of it.
Yeah,
people knew I went to church, and that was okay in a country town to be a Christian, but being a hardcore Christian with a fairly out there approach and out there practices, that was not something I wanted to talk about in detail with anyone at school. So I managed to find a way to live as fuller and a satisfying high school existence as I could, whilst also keeping my parents and the church community happy.
Yeah.
And I believed that I was going to be able to keep that up. I believed that I always saw my whole life in the church. I never thought, one day I'm out of here. I thought, no, I'm going to try and make this work. I want to be with my family. I want to meet the Lord in the air. I believe in Him. I believe in the way we've been brought up, and I could, try to imagine bringing my own kids up in that world. But got a lot trickier as I got older.
How did you see people outside of the church, especially those who weren't going to be saved based on what your church would say?
Well, yeah, technically they weren't. They were going to hell. So that's how the church told me to look at them. And we were often told to sort of, the more hardcore people in the church only saw them as kind of conversion targets. Why would you have a deep friendship with anyone in the world if you weren't trying to save them? There was this even more hardcore line than, well, if you really love them, you've got to bring them to the Lord. You've got to try and convert them.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just pretending to be their friend. A real friend would give them the answer. You've got the solution right there. You know the true gospel, the speaking in tongues gospel. So unless you're sharing that, you're selling yourself short and selling them and the Lord short. So that was the sort of approach. But I just wanted to be a normal teenager. So with my mates from school, I just was keen to be as normal as possible. And so I wasn't talking about speaking in tongues. I was talking about footy and motorbikes and girls.
And you did bring some of your mates to the church on a few occasions. How did that pan out?
Very uncomfortable.
Was that because you wanted to save them?
Well, I felt a bit obligated to show them. And I was almost pretending to be okay and proud of what we had. And there were parts of it I was proud of. But I knew that we were always going to get to that bit of meeting where everyone started speaking out in tongues and it was going to be weird.
Yeah. And your mates were like, this is pretty hectic, man.
Well, I just didn't even talk to them about it. Like, it just sort of happened. So there were two times that I remember really well and write about in the book where two good friends came. And I brought the most open-minded friends that I had, and two of my closest friends. And I guess people that I trusted liked me enough for who I was and wouldn't reject me even when they found out my church was pretty weird. And they both knew someone else in the church, a guy who worked for them as their gardener. So they'd sort of been exposed to it. So I knew they knew it was pretty weird already. They just hadn't seen it firsthand. So yeah. I felt comfortable showing them. There were other kids that would have come along, and I wouldn't have trusted them to not sort of go back to school and tell everyone how kind of out there it was. So yeah, those two friends came, and we almost never talked about it again. They just came once, saw it, and kind of went, right, okay.
Yeah.
And then I never invited them back, and they never asked to come back.
Yeah. And when you see their reaction, and obviously you value their opinion, but they're coming from a different world to you, did that factor into your own thinking about how all that looked and whether it was real? Was that part of it? How much were you questioning that at that age? Because I think you say the first time you ever questioned if speaking in tongues was real or if it was being made up was when you were 10 and you were doing it in church, and you heard another kid doing it and didn't sound all that impressive, and then you're listening to yourself and you're like, is the Holy Spirit speaking through me, or am I making it up? And you're like, wait, is everyone making it up? Because if everyone's making it up, then none of it's real. And that was the first time that you considered that. So did your friends looking at it and going like, hey man, this is, thanks for bringing us, but this is pretty weird. Did that heighten that questioning? In the teenage years, the doubts would go away for long periods of time, and I'd just be able to get on with living my life, being in my safe little bubbles of footy and home life and then church life, and keeping them a little bit separate. So no, it didn't send me into big spirals of doubt at that age. The doubts kind of, they were there, but they weren't really vexing me. It wasn't till I left home and went to uni and spent a lot of time on my own. And these are the sort of things you notice more when you look back over your own life story and see where the big transitions are. And once I didn't have that bubbly, close community around me, I was boarding in the house of an elderly couple on the northern beaches of Sydney, and would go to uni and didn't know anyone, and then would come home in the afternoon and didn't know anyone in my neighbourhood, and didn't have my three brothers around, or my parents or my neighbours. Then I had a lot more time to think. And once the doubt intersected with loneliness, then it started to hurt. But it was also coming at a time where I had to think about my future, because I was going through those big transitions. When it was in the safety of the school envelope, do you know what I mean? That envelope of time where you actually don't have to think about the future when you're at school, because your future is, your future is the next year at high school or the next term. You know, it's sort of, there's a real structure set out for you. But once I started really looking into the future, and those sort of obvious structures were gone, and I was lonely, and then the doubts, that was like the trifecta that sort of made it painful. And talk about structure. Not only did you have the structure of school like most other kids, but you had the extreme structure and discipline of church and the daily rituals and all the community gathering. And it sounds like you did a lot of stuff on a regular basis as a community. Is part of the reason that they keep everyone so busy, perhaps so you've got less time to question things? I guess so, yeah. Or less time to build up friendships with people outside the church, your worldly friends, as they were called. There's all this
coded language, by the way. I hope you picked it up in the book. Just these terms that you're like, ooh.
Well, worldly, actually,
that's some words.
That is a word that I picked up on, because is that suggesting that people who were part of the church were otherworldly?
Godly,
above.
or righteous.
Yeah.
And worldly was of the world, of the carnal sort of day-to-day urges, rather than, connecting with the spiritual life and
so
God.
Are you still viewing yourselves as human?
Oh, yeah. But we're just the fortunate ones who found the right path to God. That's how we're seeing ourselves. Some people had a bit more of a pious kind of take on that. But essentially, for us kids, it's like we were told that we were lucky to be born into the church who happened to have it right.
Yeah. Because it was just that one church that was right, wasn't it? And everyone else was wrong?
Essentially, yes. Technically, they would say, well, any other church that has the same doctrine as us, as in speaking in tongues being the tangible sign of salvation, they had it right too. But the head pastor, this guy, Lloyd Longfield in Melbourne, who's passed away now, his famous line was, "We're not the only ones, but it's the only way." And then he would sort of have this funny look in his eye because we didn't know of any other church that had it the same way. So essentially the double meaning was that there was no one else and this was the right church.
Yeah. And there was a particular moment where the church was split in half over the notion of sex outside of marriage. So it came into law, I suppose you'd say, that for half the church, I think it was, who chose to believe this, it was, if you have sex outside of marriage, then you're going to get excommunicated. And then half the church thought that was going too far. Is that what happened?
Basically, yeah. So when I was about 14, there was a massive schism in the church. And this actually happens with a lot of Pentecostal churches. They split off and someone has a new idea of how things should be done and starts his own church. And it's a very unstructured sort of part of the Christian world compared to, say, Catholics and Anglicans, which have a much more locked in sort of structure of diocese and leadership and training. Yeah. So dad comes home. He's been at the big pastors meeting in Sydney and he's like, oh, that was pretty heavy. And comes home and says, so our leader, Pastor Lloyd, has said that we need to tighten up the fornication policy, basically. And he decided that the previous punishment for fornication, sex before marriage, wasn't strong enough. So what they used to do was kick someone out for a few months and then the couple could come back if they got married, or, if they didn't want to get married, maybe one of them would come back and not the other one. But they were sort of pretty tainted. It was still really serious, but that wasn't enough, apparently. He'd reread 1 Corinthians and realised he'd missed some key details, and actually they needed to be kicked out of the church forever.
Right.
No forgiveness, none of those sort of concepts you normally connect with Christianity. They were out the window because the book of Corinthians was very clear about fornication.
Of course. And this is when you were 14 and pretty interested in fornication at this point.
Well, I'd put my interest off into the future, but I did know that it would potentially be a problem down the track. But no, still at that age, I was like, oh, that's not going to be a big problem for me because I'm planning to have sex for the first time with my future wife. So I didn't see it as like an immediate threat, but I was I definitely noticed that my dad chose the more stricter side of the church. So he had a choice to make. He could have gone, because all these other pastors got up and did what I think was the right thing to do within that context, which is say, no, this goes a step too far. This contradicts one of the core messages of the gospel. And we shouldn't be doing this, And what happened was my early teenage years were a lot cruisier, but around this time, the church did take a much more hardline stance, and this was the kind of symbol of it. But bringing that in meant that we ended up cutting off half the people who didn't agree with that policy change. So they started the Revival Fellowship, and we remained the Revival Centres. And we went from Revival Centres of Australia to Revival Centres International. We had a rebrand. And the other half took the name the Revival Fellowship, which is ridiculous when you think about it. So it got split in half, and we took the more hard edge side of the church. And I was sort of thinking, Dad, why are we going to the more hard line element? So it meant cutting more people off. It meant stricter rules. And then at the next few camps that I went to, I was at these youngies camps by this stage for from mid-teens in people into their 20s and 30s. We would get this whole strict set of guidelines read to us. And so as I was getting older and I guess coming into contact with more parts of life and potentially more threats to the strictness of the church also actually got more hard line during that time as well.
And how did you see your dad making that decision and taking that stance at the time? Did you sort of disagree with it?
You know, I've ended up a journalist where I disagree with people for a living and question their logic, question their rhetoric, compare it to research or even their own actions, and challenge people to be truthful. But it's not how I grew up. My dad was very strict. He was a wonderful, loving father, but he was hardcore. There was very strict discipline, including physical discipline in our family. So we weren't brought up to question our father. And so even though in the book I sort of go through the questions that came into my mind, not for a second was I going to be standing up to my dad and saying, "Oh, Dad, I think you've done the wrong thing." That wasn't the kind of dialogue we had.
Yeah, I understand that. Were you more concerned with earning God's love or your dad's love, do you think?
Yeah, it was a lot about my parents and my community, and I was a firstborn child, so I liked pleasing my parents, and I generally had. So yeah, I didn't really want to mess with that. I didn't like getting in trouble. I wasn't a kid that sort of thrived in rebellion. So yeah, I wanted to keep my parents happy and make them proud. I loved making my parents proud.
Were you more afraid of God though, or your dad?
Oh, definitely my dad. Yeah. But it was like there was a connection between the two because he was the pastor. So he had sort of the authority of God as a leader of the church. So that there was actually kind of the combination. He could also decide whether or not I was still in the church. You know, if I'd done something bad enough, it would have been him that would have said, "Well, look, sorry, Tom, we're going to have to put you out of fellowship for a few weeks or months or permanently if I really went for it."
Which is like a suspension or a go sort of have a timeout in the corner type rule.
Exactly.
It was the case, though, that your parents weren't born into the church. They found it later in life, having already had quite a few experiences, especially your mum, including traveling overseas. And they would tell you those stories. Did that make you want to have your own experience without the restrictions of the church? Or when you heard those stories and you're like, okay, mum and dad weren't born into what I was born into, what did that make you think?
Yeah, it was a bit of a mix. On one hand, it sort of validated their experience of coming to the revival centres and speaking in tongues, and it affirmed the course of action they'd taken and their beliefs. So that was the key narrative. But then there was a sub-narrative that brought up some sort of more subconscious kind of questions. You know, once again, I didn't have the critical thinking hat on at that point. I guess you sense a bit of that more in the book because I've been able to look back and realize what was going on. So the sub-narrative was that my parents were wild. My dad had run away from being conscripted in the army, moved to Sydney, was a surfer, hitchhiked around the place, then went in the army, then ended up in the bush up in Arnhem Land, working in a mine and becoming really good friends with the local community up there, and then becoming a mad hippie, studying journalism at Bathurst and, you know, living that loose kind of 70s hippie life. And my mum had travelled through India, through the Middle East, all the way to Europe in the 70s at the age of like 23. And she'd gone to a fancy private school in the eastern suburbs of Sydney and partying in King's Cross. And, it was never celebrated in the church testimonies. It was more like, oh, this is what I'd done before and I lost my way and then I found God. But my ears were drawn to the dominant narrative, I was also listening to the sub-narrative going,
that sounds good.
They were pretty, they were pretty cool. My parents were actually cool. Yeah. And I wouldn't mind doing some of that kind of stuff. Like, I don't want to lose my way, but I like traveling around the world, or that sounds awesome. And the people they were meeting, and this Wolfgang bloke that Mum was living with in Germany,
the drug dealer
before she was married. He sounds cool. And so that's my mind was kind of a little bit split.
But it was very much framed like my life only got good when I found the church, and before that it was all sin, and you don't want to go there, Simba. And you were sort of like, I don't know, it sounds like it'll be all right.
Exactly.
At what point did you start to feel more embarrassment for your alignment with the church?
So in high school, I was able to kind of stage manage it a bit more because I had these long-term relationships with people, and they saw all sides of my personality and my character, and I could prove myself in different environments, in sport, friendship, academically, on the motocross track, whatever it was, and then my church life was just one element of that. And then it got harder at university, where I make friends with people, and I was making friends from scratch, and those things that were awkward to explain were more difficult to work around. It's like, oh, cool, you want to come to the uni bar, or, and drinking was a lot more of a thing. Whereas, in high school, you've got a lot more pursuits, a lot more different ways to connect with people. But the older you get in Australian society, unless you're still playing a lot of sport or other sorts of hobbies, drinking is the main way that people. And so that got harder to work around. At the same time, I'd moved to Sydney, and the church assembly was bigger there, and there was more of a culture of pretty much having all of your social life within the church, whereas in Mudgee, I actually had a really good balance. So that's when it got a bit harder to explain, and I became less comfortable with it myself. And so, the new friends that I made at uni, basically, I met some people that were so nice to me. I was a massive dork from the country, so naive, and I met these great kids from Sydney, and they actually really were really nice to me. I was always fearing that I'd be rejected for what I was embarrassed about myself, but I kind of kept that in a bit of a pigeonhole, didn't tell them too much about it, and then just tried to be myself, and I had a great time. But I looked back and I was really sad that I never made the most of those friendships. Like, I didn't really make those friends for life at uni because I couldn't give them my whole self, because so much of my life was in the church, and there was so much I didn't want to talk about and wasn't proud of.
So there was that barrier there where you couldn't get past and establish those real deep connections, because they were going to have to see that part of your life, and that wasn't something you were willing to reveal. Was it also the case that there was more pressure to sort of choose one or the other, given that most people, as they get older, their whole social life starts to revolve around the church after they leave school? Did that make you feel like, I've got to either do that or I've got to do something else?
It ramped up the pressure. Exactly as you explained. It became a lot more about the church, which meant that I was forced to question whether the way the church was making me live was the right way to go. And I was forced to wear more of a price for it. Whereas in Mudgee at high school, I managed to have the best of all worlds. Whereas that was much harder in Sydney, where the church was more hardcore and I couldn't get as much balance. And that was a reason why, when the doubts came back with more space and a little bit of loneliness, that they started to resonate a lot more, because I was really thinking, is this really how I want to live? Is this really the place I want to occupy in this life?
How did choosing a profession as a journalist, as someone who asks questions, impact all of that?
Well, that came much later. So when I was at uni, I was going to study journalism. That was what I hoped my career might be in. But then I sort of got worried that I wouldn't have enough money, and my dad instilled a little bit of his own financial insecurity into me. So I did a commerce degree.
Yeah.
Because I was so lonely, dislocated and scared in my first year of uni, I just became a mega nerd and just really dug into my studies and just ended up absolutely shocking myself, getting these really good marks in subjects like economics and stuff. I was like, oh, I'm really good at economics.
It's
That's
amazing.
weird.
It's amazing what you can do when you're not drinking.
Yeah. When you're not drinking and you're full of fear, it really clarifies the mind, you know? So I ended up working in an investment bank, and it was during those years when it really started to flare up with the church. And it actually wasn't several years later until I started the journalism journey properly.
And during that period, you also had this relationship that we mentioned earlier, and there was pressure to make that more and more serious, and she was pressuring you to sort of reinstate or bump up your commitment to God and the church. And that's when you really started to feel more of these feelings of, actually, that's not the path I want to go down, or you were certainly apprehensive to go, yeah, sure, and proclaim that.
Yeah, so because the commitment to the relationship in the church came as a joint deal, I felt really suffocated, and it forced me really to think about the future even more and what I really wanted. So I was dating what I thought was the coolest, most beautiful girl in church, and I really loved her desperately, actually. I was like a little puppy dog around her initially, but then at the age of 19, she's like, so when do you think we'll get married? I was like, what? What are you talking? Like, one, do you actually like me and you really want to marry me? And two, like, not yet. I'm a second year uni student, completely struggling and lost. I can't see myself in that phase of life. And that was a weird moment. And it was just strangely where I got my power back in that relationship. And it sort of shifted into equilibrium. But then towards the end of what was 3 years, I just wanted to have fun, and I was starting to feel more confident. Those friendships at uni went up another level, and I sort of tuned out of the relationship a little bit and started occasionally going to uni parties. I might go to a nightclub here or there, still not drinking, not really pushing any boundaries, but that started to really worry her, because these were symbols that I wasn't going to completely play by the rules, and that made me a bit of an unpredictable quantity.
And she herself was sort of a representation of the church. Like you said, you were choosing to opt out of the relationship, but really you were struggling because you were opting out of the church, and you knew that they were one and the same.
Well, the relationship norms were all governed by the church, and she just happened to take it all in, hook, line and sinker, with no questioning. She really believed in the doctrine of the church, and that all the rules that were borne out and through that doctrine.
How are you going with the abstinence part of things at that point, having been in an adult relationship for years?
Yeah, well, finally I was starting to be a bit more tested, and occasionally it got a little bit saucy, like saucy for a Christian, that is, not for like a normal person. And there was heavy petting, some hands over the pants type stuff. Yeah, at the most,
real hardcore stuff.
So I give a pretty vivid description of what blue balls feels like in the book.
Yeah, I remember reading that this morning, and you talking about how it actually hurt you and you had to stop.
Haven't you been there?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of young men will feel your pain on that one.
Totally.
And then it got to a point where you ended up traveling overseas as well for quite some time, spending some time in Europe, and then letting your hair down more, trying alcohol for the first time, and smoking a joint as well, and starting to feel like, actually, this is the real me. Can you talk a bit about that point in your life?
Yeah. So that was a huge life-changing journey. At the end of uni, I won this $2,000 scholarship for an essay, and so I thought, oh, before I start my full-time job working at a bank, I'll go on this 6-week trip. And I just had no idea how much that trip was going to change me. Again, felt deeply lonely and challenged at certain points of that trip, but then opened up and met people and had the most mind-blowing adventures where I just embraced the full freedom of life and didn't feel like people were really watching me, and I could just sort of say yes to things. And I just became absolutely intoxicated by life on this trip. And I met some people that completely blew my mind, broke all the stereotypes of what bad worldly people were supposedly like.
Yeah.
And also from one guy, this guy, John from Scotland, who I met in a backpackers in Barcelona, and he was this crazy cat. He brought to me a very different perspective on Jesus and showed me another way of seeing Christianity that actually resonated a lot more with what I felt it should feel like: love and charity and forgiveness and caring about other people, a much more practical, charitable view of the Bible, not this sort of critical, dark, heavy, strict, and ultimately quite negative view that had been slowly kind of pushed down more strongly on me.
Yeah, so much less about punishment and much more about love and sharing and community and the positive things that you'd seen throughout your life but hadn't been the focus, and less so, it seems, as you got older and the church took that more hardline stance. What did you realize when you were on this trip about life in general and about yourself?
I realized I wanted to live a big, beautiful life. I wanted to be open-hearted and to connect with people and feel that passion of life. And I could see that the strictness of the church wasn't letting me do that.
So what did you do with that from there? How did you realize that and then make those tough decisions from then on?
Well, that's where it got really tricky, and that's where the book kind of really slows down and goes into detail about how that all played out and how hard that was. So I get home from this trip, and my 21st birthday is a few days later, and I have to confront Kate, the girlfriend, and be honest about the fact that I broke all the rules overseas and that I actually had met this girl from the Netherlands and traveled for a week with her up to Switzerland and shared a bed with her, but never kissed her. But all these weird lines that I'd drawn, but essentially I'd been unfaithful, essentially. And so that instantly blew up the relationship. Boom, that was over. Then I had my 21st birthday and all my friends and loved ones were there from the church. And I was like, oh, this is not going to be as easy as just like throwing my life in the bin. Like, I love these people. They've traveled here from all over Australia to be here in my backyard for my 21st birthday. But then a few weeks later, my brother and I went to the Mardi Gras. And that was against the rules, but we were like, let's just go anyway. And I saw at the Mardi Gras this same energy that I'd seen in Europe on the streets of Barcelona that had just been so exciting. I was like, there's all this freedom and beauty and passion right here in Sydney. But I just have been shut off to it because of all the strict rules. So I turned up to church the Sunday after the Mardi Gras, and they called my brother and I into a meeting and said, we have reason to believe you have attended Sydney's gay and lesbian Mardi Gras. We're like, wow, someone knew about this and has dobbed us in. Maybe they were there. I don't know how this got back to them. But they booted us out of the church, put us on a suspension. We said, oh, how long are we out for? And they said, we'll get back to you in a few weeks. So I sensed it was going to be a fairly short-term suspension, maybe about a month. And I sort of thought about all the other people who'd been kicked out for something of that kind of magnitude and guessed it would be about a month. And when we left, Sam and I were driving home from church, and I was like, this is awesome. I'm out. I'm never going back. And he was bursting into tears, wondering how we're going to tell our parents. And it wasn't the end point. No, I got dragged back into the church in probably one of the most emotionally intense moments of the book.
And when you finally did leave, how did that affect your relationship with your parents? And what was the hardest part about really cutting that off?
Yeah, like the moment where I left after the Mardi Gras was kind of fun, and I still had this like excitement and momentum from that trip overseas. But then I went back in sort of against my own judgment, thought, before I gave it all up, I was sort of this guy sort of boxed me into this really manipulative way of thinking. He said, what if you've been born into the right church, the only church that has it right, and you haven't given it 100% and you walked away disappointing everyone? Have you really given it 100%? And technically, we always do things for ourselves. So maybe I hadn't given myself 100%. And I sort of got boxed into his way of thinking. And so I gave it another go. And then I got kicked out again when the girl from Europe came to visit me. And the second time, I still don't know exactly why, the second time really hit me. And it was like my world was ripped out from under me. And suddenly I was really stressed. And then they kicked me out of my house. And I had nowhere to stay. And I had this girl from Europe out in Sydney. And my parents were no longer understanding where I was at. Whereas before they'd sort of understood. They saw some of the same problems with the church and sort of agreed with me. But this second time, it just got dark, and my parents didn't understand me. They didn't know what was going on with this girl, Anna from Europe, and I just felt completely alone. And I started feeling this ache in my chest, this literal physical pain. And so I thought, maybe this is God sending me a message. Like, that's how sort of intense the logic was.
Yeah.
Imagining, well, what if I did this, this, and this? And I tried to see if just thinking about that pathway would give me more ease, or sort of take away the pain in my heart. So I was playing out all these scenarios and wondering if I'd stepped off the path of my destiny or disappointed God or done the wrong thing. And so, yeah, there was a really dark, tough period for me there.
Like wondering if you were being tested and you'd failed and this was all meant to be part of it, but you weren't up to it, and going through all these thoughts in your head. At that point in your life, in terms of your actual mental health, did you ever feel like you were really struggling with that, be it depression or anxiety or something not diagnosable? How did you view your own mental health as a young man at that time?
So this was 2002. I hadn't even heard of mental health. I didn't know really what depression or anxiety was. And I didn't look at it through that framework at all. I looked at it through the framework of, am I doing the right thing by God? That was my framework. And so if I was feeling bad, it's because I was doing the wrong thing by God. It wasn't like a diagnosable mental health problem. So when it all blew up and I'm kicked out of my house and I'm at work trying to get my work done, but all these thoughts are swirling in my head and I'm not knowing where I'm going to move to out of my house. My heart was pumping. I couldn't think. What was really happening was I was being made to feel really anxious because of what was going on in my life. And that's why my heart was racing. It wasn't God sending me a message. It was like, it was physical stress.
But you're taught to think that mental health wise, it all comes back to God. And if you're feeling bad or you're not where you want to be, then that's all based on your commitment or lack thereof to God and not because of mental health, which didn't exist.
Exactly. Yeah. It was like your happiness came through your relationship with God.
And where did all this lead when you finally stepped away and then became a journalist and then have gone on to live this big, rich life that you wanted to live, which seems so far from the restrictions placed on you as throughout your whole younger years? It seems from the outside looking in that you have lived an amazing life and a very interesting life and gone so much further than you might have imagined. Yeah, what's that been like for you with that point of reference from how you grew up?
Yeah, well, on Hack, we ended up doing lots of stuff about mental health, and it very quickly to me felt like the most important, powerful stuff we ever did on the show, hearing people open up and share their stories. And so for all those years, I was sitting there hearing these amazing, brave stories from people about moments where they'd felt depressed or grief-stricken or anxious, or reached out, to doctors or psychologists, or had gone on medication to deal with it. And the more modern way we think about treating mental health. And I guess I never really, it's a good question you ask whether I saw it as mental health at the time. And I didn't, but I later saw it through that prism and understood a lot more about it. So I came to see, I guess, how often in these stressful situations, it does put pressure on your mental health, and how many people that affects, and how the sort of the desire for connection and community, and or when that fails, it just instantly throws people into these spirals that can then get deeper and worse. And for some people, connects with more hereditary mental health problems that make them particularly vulnerable to these big triggers in life. And so, I came to understand a lot more of those sort of life events in the mental health framework. And I also was on this other journey of, once I stepped away from religion, and it was a sort of an interesting journey. I first left my church and then went to a whole bunch of others before I realized I actually didn't believe in God as the Bible portrayed God. I see mental health almost achieving what that more old school traditional Bible-based spirituality was trying to do, both trying to get a sense of balance and happiness. But I think personally, I believe working on your mental health is a much more reliable way to get a sense of balance, rather than believing in the God of the Bible.
And how has your mental health been throughout your career since that point?
Well, I cast off my whole belief system, and I had to step away from my whole community. And so there were a lot of times where I felt really lonely again and didn't know where I was going. And I felt like a loser because I'd sort of had to start my life again at 24, 25. And I'd moved to the inner city of Sydney, and there were all these cool, smart people around who had loads of friends. And I felt like a complete outlier who was rebuilding my life from scratch again. And at the time I thought, maybe I'm a loser. Maybe I'm not interesting. Maybe these people don't want to be friends with me because I just got nothing going on, And so looking back, that wasn't you could see that through the mental health frame, that I was feeling disconnected and depressed, and I would go through these spirals of questioning my self-worth. And really, I was just feeling a bit depressed and anxious, but I've never had a full-blown mental health crisis, or needed to seek direct treatment in that way. But I've sort of learned a lot about it and spoken to a lot of people who've gone right in there, and lots of friends and family who've done cognitive behavioral treatment and really benefited from using medication at different points in their life, and also just benefited from a better understanding in our society about the way these things can affect people.
But your foundation of identity was completely rocked, and you had to adjust from a life serving God to a life where God plays no part, there's almost no bigger shift than that. Who did you find yourself to be just as Tom Tilley without religion?
Well, I just spent many years kind of striving to find connection and passion and meaning. And so if you think about all the different threads of church life that I had, that we talked about earlier on in the interview, of having a sense of community, a reason for doing things, a structure to my life, support, inspiration, like that deeper sort of awe and wonder. And basically over the next decade or so, up until sort of I felt comfortable enough to open up and tell this story, where I felt my life had kind of gotten to a good point, I just slowly built my life block by block of those different elements. I found my people, and I realized that for me, probably because of the way I'd grown up, community was crucial to me, like knowing people and having close friends and lots of people around. So
yeah,
that became a real focus for me. And that was mostly it often was through the prism of partying. Like I just loved going to house parties, meeting people, going to clubs, being up all night. I loved it.
I definitely relate to you there.
Yeah, and people see that as kind of destructive, and it can be. But I don't think it really was for me. I just had a thirst for people and kind of finding my place. And maybe looking back, I wish I had a bit more self-security, that I didn't maybe need to find that validation in meeting and being liked by other people. But in many ways, it was awesome. I loved being out and meeting people, and I came to love people, and people came to love me, and we connected, and we had good times and bad times, and I made a huge sea of amazing friends in Sydney and around the country. And then, through Triple J, I made a whole nother community of people in the media and all kinds of people right across society. And then I was in the band with Client Liaison, and we just had friends all around the country going into festivals and rolling into nightclubs afterwards. And eventually I just felt like I had this big, beautiful, community all around me on that really close personal level, but also on this much bigger, more exciting kind of level. So community was a huge one for me. I found sort of that deeper sense of awe in nature. I also get that same kind of deep euphoric feeling sometimes when I'm reading about history, and just feeling like I'm getting this true, deeper understanding about who the hell we are as human beings, and that so many of the people who've gone before us have been grappling with all the same problems. And so maybe the way we look at mental health at this point in history, through, neuroscience and, diagnosable conditions like anxiety, depression, or bipolar. I think, psychologists, historians, philosophers have been grappling with the same things for so long. And for some reason that makes me feel connected. And then my work was a big passion, a source of passion for me as well. So yeah, I sort of just really worked to build a life that served all those needs that I had. And so that's kind of been my approach to life, is like to make it happen, and to fill it up with things that I find fulfilling.
Yeah, and from listening to you talk, it's all based on that word connection, which we know is the opposite of addiction. And even the church, it's not like nothing positive came out of it. It seems like you took a huge amount of positives out of being raised that way, although there was such a negative side to it as well. But connection is omnipresent through it all. And in your life after leaving the church, you've been able to find connection elsewhere and build that into your life and make your life about that and create connections between other people. And that's something that's consistent within the church and outside of it, because I think that's the most fundamental thing to human nature and what we all need and want. But obviously there's a lot of different ways to get it, and no one way is correct. But to have a life devoid of it is hell. But just perhaps, not in a literal sense. So I'm conscious that Tommy gotta get moving. But what do you put your faith in now?
I guess it's not in one thing. It's like I just put it in living a fulfilling life and working towards that in a practical way. And also the other thread to it is accepting uncertainty and knowing that you're going to be rattled, you're going to feel alone. you're going to feel completely out to sea, and that is totally fine. It's part of the human experience. In fact, it often inspires you to live your most powerful moments or come up with the biggest solutions or deepest thoughts. So yeah, it's all those other things I mentioned, like the real building blocks in life. And as you say, a key part of that is community, connection, friendship, love, knowing people, being open and honest with them, but then building in resilience to that as well. So first, as I said, knowing that like the shaky moments will come, but you can ride them out. You can breathe your way through them, and trust that it's going to be okay. I guess, look, when I think about it, underlying all of that for me personally is just this kind of optimism. I just feel like life is beautiful and it's going to be okay. That is my underlying belief. And that might be a hangover from the Christian days as well, where I sort of still think that there's got to be a reason for this. And the ending won't surely just be stuck in a hole with no consciousness or memory. Like, I still sort of think there's something beautiful even after we die. So I just sort of have this vague, undescribable positivity, and that is, I guess, what sort of buoys me through a lot of the other moments, and sits underneath that more specific kind of framework.
Well said. And Speaking Tongues is really an enthralling book that's written with that tone that makes you want to read more, and it's very relatable. I really enjoyed reading it. Unfortunately, having to skip through it on a first reading, just sort of brushing through it, but I'm looking forward to sitting down and really reading it in detail. Where can people get your book?
So Speaking in Tongues is in all major bookstores, or if you're watching this online, just go to Booktopia and search Speaking in Tongues, Tom Tilley, and that's the easiest way to get it. So thanks for having a look at it, Callum. And look, I do hope that it can offer people, I guess, an encouragement that when life feels crazy, that there's a way through it, and that if you're growing up in a world that doesn't make sense to you, that you can methodically question it, break it down, and find out which bits are really truthful and what really is healthy for you and what isn't. But know that while that might feel really daunting at the start, there is a way through that.
Yeah, and you embody that, and it's a powerful message. So thanks, Tom. Really appreciate your time, and congratulations with the book, because it's a great piece of work and a tremendous story, mate.
Oh, thanks so much. And you've really gotten in there and engaged with the real crux of it. So I really appreciate it, Callum.
That's it for this episode. If you're getting some value out of the show, please help us out with a quick rate and review on Apple Podcasts. Everything we do is recorded in video, so follow Youngblood Men's Mental Health on Instagram and Facebook, and Youngblood Mental Health on TikTok. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, and please leave us a comment or send us a message if these stories resonate. We'd love to hear from you. And most importantly, please share the podcast with anyone in your life who might need it. We're all about reaching as many people as we can. This is Youngblood. Thanks for being part of the mission. Catch you next time.